Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to explain how all this stuff works, but I want to explain to you the implications of it. And we know we've just been hearing about the collaborative economy or the sharing economy, and you're going to notice that one of the most important things about collaborating with human beings, it's not so much just the interaction, but also when it comes to the payments. And you're going to see that in the world that we live today, there's a lot of friction around that sort of thing and a lot of mistrust, in fact. And we have a lot of major institutions that are there, insert themselves in between people to be able to create that level of trust. So, human beings are remarkable creatures. With our God-given creative spirit, we create miracles every day. If you think about the history of humankind, it's been a story of our inventiveness and our ingenuity. But even though we have this insatiable appetite and desire for upgrades and new features, when it comes to really new things, we have this kind of universal response to it. It's always fear and skepticism. Is this going to work? Do I need this? But what does it mean for society? Is it going to limit us in some way? Is it going to create new dangers that we have to look out for? But not only that, there's also the incumbents. There's always the people or the institutions and the organizations that have quite a nice place in society because a new technology that comes along, it doesn't exist yet that will disrupt them. But there's always a pushback when it comes to new technologies. Now, if we think about the technology that is all the ones that have come before, if you think about the telephone or the television or a radio, if you look at them, if you go and research, people didn't embrace those technologies right away. When we think about the radio, we think, well, that's a really cool device, and you can listen to music and all that. But people were very worried about radios. They thought, well, now no one's ever going to want to go out and meet people and go to shows. They're going to go sit in their dark room and just listen to the radio. The same thing with telephones. Now we're never going to go and speak to people face to face. We're going to, always be able to speak to people remotely. If you think about social media today, I know when social media started coming onto the scene, even today, people think about those friends, those thousands of friends that you have that you'll never meet. There's this notion that social media is almost like an anti-social media, where it's about these these very limited, superficial connections that are at the end of the day just meaningless and just there to kind of feed your narcissism or whatever it is. So we have this notion that technology is wonderful, but there's always the situation where this new thing comes along and it kind of makes us feel uneasy and uncertain. And one of the most important things about these exponential technologies that we've been hearing about is that you have to stay nimble. You have to have an open mind, and you have to think, well, okay, it doesn't make sense to me right now because when a new technology comes along, it's not perfect, it's buggy, and it's funny, and it doesn't really make sense. But you should have an understanding, especially since of where we've come before, where we've seen how these little ideas suddenly turn into these massive things that completely transform our lives, and we cannot live without them. Now, a very important thing about human beings is this fact that we communicate. We're separate from animals where we can transfer information, and we have these very complex societies that come out of that, this ability to communicate. And if you just think about, Gutenberg, when he created the press, it was remarkable if you think back in it. But in those days, it was again this sort of uneasiness around being able to now just publish and be able to print information that can be disseminated and everybody can have access to. There was pushback from obviously the people who had monopoly over these Bibles that were being created. But then that culminated now into this world that we live today, which is the internet, where now none of us can survive without the internet, I bet, for more than 24 hours. I know that I struggle, even sitting anywhere if I'm waiting for something to check Twitter or check my email, check WhatsApp. And now the internet is not just about communicating with people, it's about communicating with all the devices. Because now suddenly we find that it's not just humans that we need to interact with. We need to interact with all these sorts of machines, and nowadays toasters and microwaves and, your door even, can be connected to on the internet. It's very important to be able to be in touch with and be able to communicate with these devices, get feedback and get stimulation, and also provide input to these devices. But it's not just about communication. It's not just about transferring information from one person to another or from one device to yourself. Another very important aspect about life, the life that we live in, is the fact that we now need to transfer value or goods and services. The world is full of people constantly exchanging value, either exchanging information as value or goods and services, things that make the world go round. But in this hyper-connected world we live in, if we were to now think about how we transact and how we make payments and all that sort of thing, if we just think about the internet, because I'm sure many of you use the internet to make payments, there's always this sort of, it's not just this free-flowing system. If you think about an email or an Instagram post or something, what you're doing is you're connecting with the people that you want to communicate with directly, essentially. But when it comes to transferring value over the internet or in life, there's always this kind of middleman, this banking system, this institution that is there, because it's actually very difficult to be able to trust when you make a payment to somebody, especially if it's in a digital world, that money is going to get to that person, and that person who is receiving that money has to trust that if you're paying them, that the money is coming from the right sort of person. So we have this system now that none of us really think much about. We think about online payments and how we transact digitally as this just being a necessary part of it, that we have to now have some sort of middleman in the way that can extract a toll, that can enforce controls and limit your ability. But also you at this stage in the world, because not everybody in the world has access to these services, you now create a barrier to entry. If people want to now transact online, you now need to have a bank account and you have to go through all the hoops. And we know that very many people, and 80% of Africans in the world today, don't have access to digital payments. And so they are limited to cash payments, and that makes things very complicated. But also, we live on a continent where some of the poorest people live, and we have the highest cost of moving money throughout the continent. So these middlemen are not adding much value, but they are extracting a huge amount of value out of the society as a whole. And wouldn't it be amazing if there was some sort of better system? I mean, we think about all these amazing tools and innovations that we have today. Why is this one still seemingly so archaic? A banking system that's been around for hundreds of years, we still have to now think about having a middleman to be able to transact value. So if you think about the sharing economy or the collaborative economy, as you just heard, when we think about Uber, for example, Uber is a great example of where the world is moving, where people with excess capacity are able to now share that capacity and on-sell it to other people. So if Alice, let's say, wants to now hire a ride, what she does is she goes and takes out her Uber app and hails a taxi. But she's not paying the driver directly. Uber is sitting in the middle there, and essentially all Uber really does is act as a glorified payment hub. Uber facilitates the payment. But now if we could remove the fact Uber out of the situation, all the value that Alice can get from that driver, she can now transfer that money directly to the driver, and therefore being able to provide the value for the driver to have more value in the situation. It would be great if that could happen. But again, in this digital world where it's very hard to make digital payments without using the institutions that exist, this is not possible. And now it exists for many things. If you think about all those people who have abilities or excess capacity in terms of Airbnb, let's say, like your rooms, wouldn't it be amazing if now people could share the value that they have, provide it to people, but be able to earn all the income that is due to them? So now, this is another reason as well that the world, the sort of financial system is broken. It's not just about the payments. It's also about the actual money that we have today. And this is a clear example about how a system that we don't think much about is flawed. We actually, for the last 45 years or so, since 1971, have been living in a very strange world with this big financial experiment, where now we don't have this idea of a gold-backed currency, something that is kind of a law of nature. We live in this interesting world where money is kind of this sort of financial experiment that central bankers play with around the world. And we've seen how over time there are flaws in that system, and Zimbabwe was a perfect example, where we see what we imagined to be very sensible economists and bankers be able to do something like this to their currency. And this is not the only one. In the last 100 years, there have been 57 cases of hyperinflation, and Venezuela is going through it right now. So the system of money is flawed. Now, in 2008, there was a massive thing that happened. It was the financial crisis. Now, at the time, I didn't think much of it. I didn't really feel the impact of it. But this was a remarkable event that happened around the world where the system itself broke. And a lot of people were inspired by this to start thinking about a new way of a new kind of money system, but one that was not governed and controlled by a central bank that was flawed. Because of this financial crisis, what we are all now going through today is hyperinflation, in the same way Zimbabwe and Venezuela have gone through it. But we just don't really see it at this stage, because all that hyperinflation is not going into our grocery bill. It's going into all these other things that maybe many of you aren't aware of, or maybe that you're pleased about, like stock markets and asset prices. So we have this real problem in the financial system today. But now, motivated by this, a group of researchers and developers started thinking about how do we reinvent the system. And a few years ago, this article came out in The Economist magazine, and it talked about this new technology that was the most important invention since the internet. Now, when you hear about something like that is as important as the internet, of course you should take notice, because the internet is so important. It talked about this technology called Bitcoin. Now, unfortunately, Bitcoin over the last few years, and especially the last few months, has been going on this sort of hypermania stage, and a lot of people, when they first hear about it, they think of it as this very strange sort of Ponzi scheme type investment thing that confuses most of us. There's this thing about what we think of as bubbles in markets. A bubble is generally a bull rally where you don't have a position, if you know much about finance. But this technology really has the promise to be able to absolutely transform this world that we live in, to disrupt society as a whole, especially when you think about central banks and governments, but also to add an enormous amount of value and to enable all these wonderful things that we think are going to be possible in these collaborative or sharing economies. And if you're not taking something like this seriously right now, eventually it's going to intrude into your life, much like the internet did. If many of you are old enough to remember when the internet came along, this is going to eventually form part of your life, and you're going to be moved by it and influenced by it, and the world is never going to be the same again. But it's not all bad, it's going to be all good, in spite of what you might hear. So now what we have with this new technology is this idea of this kind of global banking system that isn't controlled or governed by any government. Now, of course, that's a frightening prospect if you think about people who might want to be able to subvert this system, terrorists and all those sorts of things. But, with every technology, and the internet was exactly the same. When the internet came along, and I remember, I'm old enough to remember, in fact, I was doing my computer science degree in the mid-90s, and, I was on the internet, and I had an email address, but my friends didn't. In those days, it was this very dark place. Who's in those chat rooms talking to my children? And, what about, all this and that? And we're kind of in that space right now where we have this incredible enabling technology, but, there's obviously going to be that bad element that creeps in. But remember, with every single technology, there's always going to be somebody who wants to abuse that technology. And don't let that now make you decide that this is an awful thing. This is really going to have this incredible ability to remove the middlemen out of every single transaction, and to be able to now have people transact with each other in a trusted way, where suddenly now it is possible to have these sharing economies, and it's incredibly exciting. Now, this is another aspect of it. If you have this global banking system, you have the ability now to be able to send money anywhere in the world without restrictions, directly to the people or the causes that you believe in. One of the projects that I initiated a few years ago, I was working in the energy space, and one of the issues that we had was we were building with these prepaid smart metering systems. And I thought, this is a really interesting idea. Imagine if you could now put a meter into a little needy African school. What could happen now is that donors from around the world would be able to directly fund the energy needs of that school. So we created this little pilot, and if you want to see more about this, there was a TEDx talk that I gave specifically about this project, but it shows you that it's not just about banking and the middlemen in between transactions. There's another sort of middlemen. When it comes to charity organizations. Now, of course, charity organizations are wonderful and we need them, but they also introduce friction and uncertainty. Often when you donate to a needy cause, you don't know where that money is going exactly. There could be, they might distribute it in a way that maybe you don't agree with. Also, there's corruption and all those sorts of things. So here what we can do now again, when it comes to moving value from one person to the other, we can now remove that uncertainty. We can directly fund those causes we believe in. So we have now this ability, using a technology like this, to not only communicate with each other and create these ties across the world, but also now to be able to really and profitably and functionally provide value to people, where we can now get paid for our services directly without having to use some sort of middleman, where we don't have to have this huge toll that's extracted out of society, where we can now really bring value back into the world and facilitate all these wonderful things that we see going ahead in terms of the technologies that exist today. So I just wanted to leave it with that. I wanted to give you this very quick, brief overview about the technology, and to make you think this is not something that is scary, because I like to think of myself as somebody who is always going to be with it, and anything that is new, that is interesting, I'm going to be able to jump into. But I know I'm not like that either. It took me a long time to get into things like Facebook and all that back in the day. And for the same thing with you, I'm sure all of you would love to think of yourselves as, forward-thinking, intuitive about what's coming next. This is definitely something that has the promise to be able to impact the world, but also really change the world, in terms of the society and these government structures. Now, a lot of us, depend on this thought that governments are these solid things that are out there to protect us and look after us. But the reality is that something like this is going to disrupt how the fabric of society is constructed. And if you're not nimble, if you're not willing to now embrace these new ideas, you might very well be somebody who comes late to the party and doesn't take advantage of it. Now, every one of you in your own lives and your own careers, you need to think about these new innovations that are coming along, as you heard earlier, with these exponential technologies. Because you might be trying to achieve something in your sphere, but you're being held back for whatever reason. So you have to be nimble. You have to be open-minded about these things. And yes, of course, when you're first confronted with them, they're going to be strange and unusual. But if you are somebody who now embraces that and decides to learn as much as you can, at the end of the day, it's all about education. Your own education, not just the education of others. That if you're trying to be somebody who's aware of all these things, and if you do the research, you will benefit and you'll be able to accelerate the progress and of what you're trying to achieve. Okay, so thank you very much. I know that was a very quick overview of what is going on here, but I hope that you go forward in your lives and you think about this technology very seriously. Thank you.
Come on out of your dream.